so our high school students need to know about your model of memory, the multi-store model of memory, and they need to know about the studies. And for them, I think it's a real thrill. I know it is because my students have told me, to see the people behind the ideas, right? We see these names on the paper and in the textbook, and they have the challenging job of evaluating these theories that have stood the test of time. And so I think just knowing that they, weren't just.
What do you mean they have a challenging job? We have a challenging job.
Well,
all these theories are wrong. They're just crude approximations to reality. They're just useful.
Right. And so I think to understand the story behind some of the theories and to see the researchers, it gives them the confidence that they actually, like you say, that these are, crude models and that they are there to be evaluated. But it is unfair. I mean, we don't ask students to evaluate Shakespeare, yet we're asking them in psychology to evaluate these theories. But so to begin with, because the multi-store model has been recreated in so many textbooks, and it's reproduced, are there any misconceptions or common things that people get wrong or oversimplifications?
Gosh, it's hard to know how to answer that. First of all, I don't read the textbooks because I've been teaching for a while. So it's hard for me to judge what people have been saying about it. From my experience, people always misconstrue what everyone says. That communication in science is a difficult process. And the person who's communicating always thinks they're saying one thing, and the person who's receiving the communication usually understands it in a different way, because the words are not as precise as we hope they are, and different people have different interpretations. So I'd be surprised if people didn't misconstrue that theory quite often. On the other hand, it's not much that seems to be carried forward over the years about that theory, because the original paper chapter had, 100 pages and lots and lots of experiments and lots of models, and was fairly elaborate. I was surprised once when I went back and read it at how much was in there. What people usually take from it now is just a soundbite. They just say, oh, it's a multi-store model of memory. Or maybe they remember, if they're lucky, you remember we mentioned sensory memory and short-term memory and long-term memory. Maybe that's all. Or maybe they mentioned control processes, because we talked about those, which sort of became working memory after a while. But that's, I'm not sure people say much about that theory anymore, because if they went back and actually looked at it, they might be surprised.
Well, I did read the 110-page original paper 2 weeks ago when I sent the original email. I'm updating my textbook right now, and it's a lot in there.
Yeah.
The way that we teach it in our course, the multi-store model leads in, and the working memory model go together. So often teachers will teach the multi-store model and then the working memory model as the logical progression from that model.
Yeah, I'm not sure they're different. They're just sort of related. We talked about working memory in the paper, in that chapter. And the idea was that the working memory would be in the part of the system we were calling short-term memory. That was about it. And, that was the details of, what people have learned over the years is working memory is very complicated. And there's a lot of different short-term memories. There's stimuli reside for different amounts of time, and there's hierarchies of information, and there's all the different modalities. There's all kinds of things going on in short-term memories. Not at all simple. We were taking a rather simplified view at the time, but that was a long time ago. And but we did talk about control processes and about different types of short-term memory. So it wasn't completely out of date. Yep.
And going back to 1968, how was that paper received at that time? Like, was it, did it start a fire, or has it been more of a slow burn, or was it just another?
No, it achieved a lot of acclaim very soon. And it was I guess because, well, it's hard to know exactly why, but it was a way of putting together a lot of information about memory in a way that made sense to people, I think. And we had a good deal of evidence with the models that the number of other papers that preceded it. So I think the combination of modeling about memory and then putting it all together in a bigger system turned out to be something that caught the attention of the field. So it seemed to get a lot of play very soon. Very interesting. It actually took two tries. The first try wasn't very good, or wasn't nearly as good. Gordon Bauer suggested that needed some work. He was the editor of the volumes and a close colleague, of course, at Stanford. He suggested we needed to do some work on it. And the subsequent revision actually did make it quite a bit better. So we had two tries. That helped.
Didn't most of the cognitive revolution happen at Stanford?
There was an amazing number of people involved at Stanford at the time, because that was sort of the center of the new fields of mathematical psychology, where we were treating data in quantitative means using mathematical models at the time. Now, computer simulation models are more typical because things are too complicated for analytical derivations. But that was really the center of modeling at the time. And not only were the people there famous progenitors of the field, like Atkinson and Bauer and Estes and Suppies and a few others, but all the students who were there at the time went on to become relatively famous professors and academics and researchers. So it was quite a crew. And that was because it was really where mathematical modeling took off as a field.
So I'm curious to kind of peek behind the curtain a little bit as to what got you into mathematical modeling, and how did you get into working with Dr. Atkinson to come up with this theory of memory, as a young man in his 20s?
Yeah, as it often happens, I sort of stumbled around in my early career, doing random things until I lucked out. I started in Yale. The first course I took in psychology, I thought was horrible, and I decided I would never take another course in psychology. It was a course given by a now deceased famous developmental psychologist named Ed Ziegler, who his teaching method consisted of walking up to the board, turning his blackboard, turning his back on the students, writing out in chalk his lecture. We were expected to copy it. There was no text. We were expected to copy it and then get tested on what we copied. And even the subject wasn't that interesting, but the style of teaching was abysmal. So I don't know. Anyways, I then had 7 roommates who were doing psych honors things because they were pre-med at Yale. And I kept talking with them about their research. And that got me interested enough to say, gee, if I'm going to be spending all my time talking research, then I better do some of my own. So I walked over to the Psych building. And after a couple of tries, I ended up with an animal learning researcher named Frank Logan, who didn't put me into any animal lab, but we did a human experiment based on his theories that led to a publication. But I had by that time become a math major, and after cycling through many others. And for that reason, Frank, who was a friend of and knew Gordon Bauer, suggested I go to Stanford, and where Gordon Bauer was. And he knew they were doing math modeling, and I was a math guy. So I did apply to Stanford in psychology. I applied to law schools and math schools, but I chose Stanford for psychology because I liked the idea of research. I was hooked up with Gordon Bauer my first year, I did a free recall and short-term memory, which have ended up in various forms in the chapter. Gordon went to England after my first year and on sabbatical, and therefore he traded me to Atkinson, who was also working on similar subjects on short-term memory at the time with other students. So then I spent a good deal of time working with Atkinson on models of short-term memory and memory. And that led to the chapter. And Gordon, of course, knew we were doing this. He was familiar with what I was doing from the first year. And he suggested a chapter for the volume he was working on. And that led to the production of the chapter, which by that time was summarizing a good deal of research by myself, by Dick and his students at the time, or his other students, I should say, and postdocs.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. So from the multi-store model, and I have to be honest, I'm not that as familiar with the SAM and the REM models. The search of associative memory, is it?
Yeah. So the search of associative memory was a way of elaborating extensively the original thoughts in the chapter for recall tasks, all kinds of recall tasks. Recognition came later. And it put into place the important ideas of context as important cue, but as an important feature that's stored in memory and that's used to probe memory. This would be aside from the items themselves that you were trying to remember. This was the surround, the environmental surround, both personal and environmental, that was associated with the situation in which the items were presented. That turned out to be very important. And then search was elaborated in the SAM models with my colleague Rayamakers, who came over from Amsterdam and was finishing his PhD with me. And search was laid out. It was already there in the early writings, but it was laid out in detail and was used to do quantitative modeling of a good deal of data in the papers that we produce. And one other thing we did was surprisingly found in a Psych review paper we wrote in 1981 that we could predict, surprisingly, something called the part list queuing effect, which was very strange. Everybody was assuming that memory was associative, that we remembered items that were due to the fact that they were associated with other items everywhere in memory. And I'm sure that's true. But given that that was the assumption, Norm Slameka carried out some experiments saying, gee, if we would give a list of items to be remembered by someone, for just a list and try to free recall them all, suppose we give half of the items on a list as helpful cues and seeing if it helps you remember the remaining ones. If indeed you were storing the associations between items, then these should be very helpful cues and should help you remember the remaining items. And in fact, that didn't work. If anything, the remaining items were recalled less well given the cues than they would be if you didn't give any cues at all. And then we thought that was strange. We had an associative model, the SAM model that we were, the search of associative memory model. So we said, oh, gee, let's try the model and to apply it to this partless queuing situation. We'll find out what's wrong and how we can fix our model. But the model predicted the result. We didn't understand why at first. And then we tried doing various things to the model. We deleted various things from the model and took various things out. No matter what we did, it kept predicting the effect, even though it was an associative model. It took some time, actually several years after we published the paper, before we actually got a clear idea of why the model actually did predict this. But that was interesting. That was the sort of the highlight of the Psych review chapter we wrote. And then we wrote a book chapter that laid out the whole system in much more detail. Right. So that was the an extension of the original thoughts in '68 and laid out in considerable more detail and applied to many long-term search situations, recall
Mm-hmm.
situations. Then recall came along a little later.
And that's the retrieving effectively from memory, the recall?
Well, first there was a paper I published with a student named Gary Gillen, laying out how recognition might operate. But that was okay. It laid out the basic ideas. But the REM model was a little different because it was based on a normative Bayesian analysis of what ought to happen if the system was optimal in some sense. And we worked out mathematically what would be an optimal way to do recognition. And it turned out to be provide a pretty good account of recognition data and solved a problem that had been lying around for a long time in how you set the criterion for judging an item. So the idea behind the recognition memory was you show an item to the subject and say, was that in the list you just saw? Let's say, that was a task. And the general idea of most of the models was that you use a feeling of familiarity when you probe memory with that item and context. You get a feeling of familiarity, and if that familiarity is high enough, you say it was on the list. That was the basic idea. But how do you decide what criteria to set? How much familiarity is needed to say old? And it turns out that's a problem because in all kinds of different conditions, when you change things like frequency of the items or length of list or number of repetitions or anything else, you would have to figure out a new criterion that was appropriate to use because familiarity would be changed. And the REM model had the interesting result that we could have a single criterion based on the way familiarity was calculated that would apply in all cases. It turned out to be something called the likelihood ratio of 1, the way we calculated things. And that would allow you to know what criterion to use. It could be adjusted a little bit, but it was the basic default criterion that would be used for recognition, applying in all kinds of recognition situations. That was nice because we could derive that mathematically to show that was a good thing to do. And that was done with another student, Mark Stivers.
And now, am I right in thinking these ideas are being used in AI, or are there other applications from across these models?
Well, yeah. Applications are an interesting question. I think most of what I've done tends to be what you call basic science, understanding how cognition works. Mm-hmm. Applications have been taken from various of my works by others, not by me usually, especially in the attention work. I've done a lot of other work on that's become well known on attention with like Walter Schneider in the 70s. And a good part of that work has been taken and used in various ways in clinical practice. Some of the memory work has somehow led, in part, or helped lead to understanding things like false memory. Mm. So my colleague at Stanford, Elizabeth Loftus, has become famous for showing you can implant false memories in people. And that's important for her fixing various bad therapeutic practices over the years, where people were implanting false memories of childhood abuse by parents when they were innocent. And also in eyewitness testimony, because of interrogations by police that would implant memories that were not valid. And a lot of that work on false memory grew out of the basic memory models that were developed. Mm-hmm. So I'd say that I haven't really done the applications, but right. Others have taken the work and used them for various applications.
Mm-hmm. So earlier in the chat, we were talking about how our students have this challenging job of evaluating these models. Right. is there any way you could help them out? Are there any, or maybe when the model was released, were there any criticisms, or have there been criticisms where you're like, yeah, there's a bit of validity to that? Because it's hard to critique the only.
Okay, yeah. What I would say for the students is to be a little skeptical. Every model in science, everyone, from physics, if you're talking about quantum physics, all the way up through psychology and everywhere else that we make models. They're all stories that we tell each other. They're not fact, they're not reality. They're all approximations to reality, and they keep changing and getting better, we hope. And that happens in every field, and happens for every story and every model. Some of them are quite accurate. They're not perfect, but they're quite accurate. In psychology, we're a long way from reality because we're often dealing with group data, for example, and people differ, and we're averaging them together. But even if you have one subject and you analyze that data, that one subject differs from moment to moment and uses different strategies at different times. And we try to make designs for experiments that reduce the amount of variation as much as possible. But the models we end up with are, in truth, are not very accurate, but they're very useful. They capture a certain amount of truth, and they sometimes generalize to other similar tasks. The Atkinson and Shiffrin model did a good job and still does. It still provides a good account of what happens in most of these experimental situations in memory. The SAM model, even better for recall. It's still I still think the SAM model is the best simple recall model that we have in the field. And that grew out of the Atkinson and Shiffrin model. And probably the best recognition model is still the one out of REM, the retrieving effectively from memory model, which grew out of that also. There's a connection between the recall models and the recognition models. The assumption was for recall to search memory, that you probe memory with an item in context. And then you have various traces in memory are activated by the similarity they have to the probe and the strength of the memory trace. And to search memory, you select from all those activations one of the traces in proportion to the activation. So ones that are highly activated tend to be chosen and then examined by the subject who's trying to search memory. It may be what the subject is desiring to find. If not, the subject will sample again and find another trace, again sampling in proportion. So that was the basic idea of recall, that you would sample traces during the search process in proportion to the activations of the traces. The more activated, the more likely to be sampled. So the way that was instantiated was you would have a activation value for a particular trace divided by the sum of all the activation values for all the traces. And that would give you the ratio or the probability of sampling. And it turned out the denominator in that fraction, the sum of all the activations, was what we use for recognition, for familiarity. So we connected recognition and recall by simply saying that the activations that are used to sample from for recall are in fact, when summed up, the value of familiarity that's used to make recognition decisions. So a closely connected recognition and recall.
Last question for students and teachers.
By the way, I got carried away and didn't actually answer your question, which was how do we evaluate these different models?
Right.
So I think utility or usefulness is the key question here. There's several things that are important about these stories we tell that are called models. One is that it communicates to others clearly what the ideas are. So a model that's overly complex often fails or overly technical often fails in not communicating well to others what are the core concepts and core ideas underlying the model. I think that the models that I've worked with have do a decent job of communicating. The REM model is a little hard because it's pretty technical. It was derived mathematically and analytically. But I think the SAM model and the original Atkinson and Shiffrin model were pretty clear and people could understand them. So it communicated well, and that's important. And the second is it accounts for a lot of data. It generalizes and doesn't just explain one thing, it explains many things. And the models, I think, did a good job of generalizing. So it turned out to be useful. So I think that two things that are most important that have helped those models are one, communication to others, and two, being able to account for lots of data.
That's really helpful.
Without tinkering too much.
Yep, that's really helpful. So yeah, the last question, is there something really important about memory that you would like students and teachers to know? Or, you know, because I know when I teach psychology, because it's so applicable, right? And I want my students to know this stuff to help them in their lives, is from all your decades of research in memory, is there something you'd like, okay, if you...
Well, there's a couple of things, because I'm often asked those questions. The first thing is everybody thinks they have a bad memory. And in a way they do. But everyone has a very good memory for things that are important to them. Talk to a golfer about the last 5 rounds they played. They'll give you every stroke. Talk to anyone about what they're interested in, and talk to somebody playing video games, and they'll tell you every move they made the last time they played, perhaps. I mean, everything, whatever somebody's really interested in and does well and thinks about and spends a lot of time thinking about, usually they're very good, their memories are very good for those things. So that everyone has a very good memory for things that are important to them as a rule. They're just very bad about things they don't care about.
Right.
I'm not very good with names of people. Part of that is age. But part of that is just that I'm not motivated to try to remember the names of people. I'd say that this is true of most people, that they don't tend to remember things they don't care about. If you do want to remember lots of things about lots of different subjects, you can spend time working at it. People who are good at trivial pursuit, have been interested and motivated to all these things that they remember, but also they work at it. That's important to them. It's interesting to them. So I'd say that if you want to, if you want to be good at remembering things you're not good at remembering, you have to work at it. But I don't know if you want to. I mean, the reason you don't remember that stuff is because you're not interested in it. Okay, so that's one thing.
Yep.
And the other thing that's important to know is memory is changeable. That is, all our memories keep changing all the time, because every time we think of a memory, we adjust it and change it. Sometimes we keep the core memory intact, so it's still pretty veridical, it's pretty correct, let's say. And other times we change it in ways that distort it, and sometimes badly so. So we have to be very careful about trusting our own memories. There's a lot of both anecdotal and actual research pointing out that this is a dangerous thing to do. Some things we do remember very well and accurately, and other things are pretty distorted. And it's just wise always to keep in mind that just because you remember something and think you remember it clearly doesn't mean it's accurate. Most spouses are aware of this, because the two spouses, when talking with each other, often remember things quite differently. Each of them often thinks the other is lying. But no, it's not that. Each of them has a clear memory, but they're different because it's changed over time.
And brothers and sisters too.
Oh yeah, everyone. I mean, this is what happens routinely, because as we go through life and call up memories, we change them. And sometimes in doing so, we distort them. And sometimes in telling people about them, we change them. It's very natural, very common. And it's just something to keep in mind when you think you remember something. to be somewhat skeptical about the validity of your own memories. That's another thing.
Excellent. Dr. Shiffrin, thank you very much for your time. I know you were just finishing your workday and I'm about to start mine. So yeah, it's an honor to sit here and talk with you, sir. So thank you very much.
Good to talk with you.
Excellent.
And I'm happy to do it. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Shiffrin. Thank you. Bye-bye.